And let's start with introductions. So I'm Kathleen Calby. Many of you know me from the Lit Cleveland events or just personally or from any number of places that I show up on screen and off. But first, I'd like to introduce Marion Starling Boyer, who's a professor emerita of communication and has published 6 poetry collections. And 2023 has been a good year for Marion. Her book, Ice Hours, was released by Michigan State University as the 2021 Wheelbarrow Prize winner. I keep having to ask her about why is it the 2021 thing, but it's just the way things reverse around. And was named New and Noteworthy in the January-February issue of Poets and Writers. Further, her collection, What Word for This, won Grayson Books 2023 Chapbook Prize. I highly recommend that book. It's just a lot of fun. Oh, good, you got a copy to show. It's a delightful book. All kinds of really odd words you would not have ever known anything about. And she writes a poem for each one of them. Boyer conducts workshops for Lit Cleveland, and this winter will join Barbara Sabol as they lead their very popular Reading Contemporary Poetry course again. That's one of the ways I met Marion and Barbara. Boyer will also conduct a poetry writing workshop beginning in April called Discovering and Enhancing Your Poetic Temperament, which involves Orff's 4 temperaments. She lives in Twinsburg, Ohio, near Cleveland, and you can read more about her at her website, MarionStarlingBoyer.com. So that's Marion's bio. Barbara Sabol. Watermark is her 3rd full-length collection, Poems of the Johnstown Flood of 1889, published by Alternating Current Press in 2023. Her book, Imagine a Town, won the 2019 Poetry Manuscript Prize from Sheila Na Gig Editions. Was I close on the pronunciation?
Sheila Na Gig, you got it.
Okay. She went on to become the associate editor of the journal Sheila Na Gig Online. Barbara's honors include an Individual Excellence Award from the Ohio Arts Council. She conducts poetry workshops through Literary Cleveland and the Cuyahoga Falls Library. Barbara is from Johnstown and now lives in Akron, Ohio with her husband and wonder dogs. So my connection with these two, which is how I ended up hosting this, is an interesting one because I started by taking classes with Marion during COVID after I'd left Ohio, which is where these two are at. And I met her through Lit Youngstown. And then in a Lit Cleveland class, I met Barbara, and they are leading these wonderful Reading Contemporary poetry sessions that they're just marvelous. I don't know if this one's all filled up again or not, but they usually fill up.
It's close.
Close. Okay. So I have this wonderful association. I'd met Marion about 2 years ago in person when I visited Ohio again, and got to meet Barbara in person this summer when I was up there, or this fall. So I just thought it would be great, because the way they do these contemporary poetry classes, that we had 2 live published poets, that we could ask them questions, we could hear their stories, we could hear them read their own poems. I thought it'd be a great idea. So I proposed this, and I got what I asked for. So, and so do all of you. So I want to preview the books just a little bit before we start in on hearing the poems. And I'll start with Marion's first, because it was published first.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, and welcome everybody. You're probably familiar with Ernest Shackleton and his trips to Antarctica and the Endurance, which sunk. His failed attempt in 1915 was called the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And so many people know that story, but what they don't know is the other half of the story, that there was another ship, the Aurora, that went to the opposite side of Antarctica in order to lay the supplies from that side of Antarctica to the center so that he would have enough material and supplies to make the entire journey. They were the Ross Seamen, and they struggled for 2 years against scurvy, starvation, snow blindness, a lack of their own materials, to lay these depots because they never knew Shackleton's ship sunk and wouldn't make it across. The fact that these men and their story has never been told bothered me for about 20 years. And so I decided to write their story. So it's a suite of poems in the voice of the Ross Sea men and in the voice of Antarctica herself.
Barbara, you want to lead off about Watermark?
Sure. So Watermark, are people familiar with the Johnstown Flood of 1889, also nicknamed the Great Flood? Well, that's what this book is about. It's docu-lyric, or both of ours are docu-lyrics, which are books written, collections of poems rooted in a historical event. So the poems in this collection, they follow the path of what's nicknamed the Great Flood, from the time prior to the sort of the perfect storm of events that caused the flood, and the disaster of 1889, and then goes to the aftermath and the reclamation following the destruction of this very, very booming industrial town. So the poems describe how the dam failure caused a 40-foot wave, if you can imagine a 40-foot wave coming down a mountainside and on its way down, picking up houses, livestock, train cars, and then that wave just gathering and rolling down the hillside into Johnstown and wiping out the town for all intents and purposes. Let's see. So the voices, it's all persona, with a few exceptions, and the voices are those of survivors, but mainly of the unidentified victims of the flood. A third of the victims were never identified, so they were buried without a name, which I always found heartbreaking. So the first two sections talk about or describe the circumstances and lives of the unidentified dead based on the morgue entries from the morgue book of 1889. And then the narrative continues into the last sections that against the backdrop of recovery and renewal. So there is a wave of hope there at the end. And then historical figures like Clara Barton, John Hess, some of the famous figures who were part of the clubhouse where the lake was, are also in this book. So, you know, a summary statement would be that Watermark is a lyric narrative of this country's largest and certainly most dramatic flood in the 19th century, told from the perspective of those whose lives it claimed, and those who lived to tell the tale. So that's Watermark.
So I'm going to ask each of the poets to read the first poem in the collection, which is a prologue sort of piece. Marion, do you want to lead off with that?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I opened the book in the voice of Antarctica herself, and she's remembering a past life of hers. Perhaps I was Eden. I was tropical once, warm with the warming effect of clouds. My lands were fern forests. Araucaria trees rose high. Baobabs grew fleshy fat with water, and rains came and drifted and came. Warmth transported me. Slow rivers spooled soft, pink, golden mists of pollen wafted across deep valleys. Rain, muted refrains. The green veils shifting across the glinting nights are my dreams of that emerald time. My days are a season long. Night lasts halfway around our star. There is no mythology here, only epics. It was ever slow, then slower, leafy. Perhaps I was Eden. I remember a sweet summons, something silken, secret, the sigh and sob of sea swells, small, spasms, an ache, snow, a massive weight covering me, groaning, a rhythm of crescendo, arching. I remember mountains rose, a tectonic lifting, molten lava. The last to survive were beech bushes. Then the cool feathers of drowsing, a slowed pulse, fog. There's no mythology here. My mountain still breathes. Plumes rise. I was tropical once. Then I became so cold, I stripped off my clothes and burrowed beneath a shield device.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Barbara, you take on yours.
All right. The prologue poem, or the opening poem, is At the Plot of the Unknowns. And just to give you a context, the plot of the unknowns refers to the unknown or unidentified drowned. And the physical context is at Grandview Cemetery in Johnstown, where there is this plot of the unknowns. And it's just tombstone after tombstone after tombstone, small little unmarked tombstones, that 777 of them. And it's really striking. So my family is buried there in this cemetery, and I've walked it many times and always visited the plot of the unknowns. I belong to a family of grave tenders. We arrive with grass shears, watering cans, season upon season. A seashell placed on a neighboring stone, small plastic farm animal on the next, say, you are not forgotten. After tamping the annuals, I kneel back, conjure my mother. If there is an after, I hope she is pleased with these small gestures. The day is radiant. Mica and quartz glisten monuments along the path to the plot of the unknown drowned, whose identical marble stones rise from the ground in narrow rows like sheaves of some strange crop. Their blank faces marked only by weather, names writ in water. Dressmaker, scullery maid, drifter, carpenter, millwright, mother, the children whose dreams scatter in the grass, you are not forgotten. I lean my full weight on one stone, knowing in my own bones there is a story here, and under the next and the next. The earth begins to warm, an elusive wood thrush flutes, crocuses open to the light.
Oh, it's so lovely, both of those openings.
Thank you.
So I think the question, and why don't you start to answer this a little bit about why each of you decided to write the book you did. Barbara, you just finished. Why don't you start this one?
Okay, sure. Well, since I've been a child, since I'm from Johnstown, I've been interested in the story of the Johnstown flood, not just because I grew up there, but because it really is it's a multi-layered narrative with so many elements. It was really hard to call all of those to create this book. In the context of the Gilded Age, the late 1800s in this country, there's an industrial boom happening, with Johnstown becoming the steel production capital of the nation, turning out steel rail for the expanding railway system. And it's a very exciting period of time. Lots of progress, changes in social mores, changes in fashion, literature. I mean, it's really quite an exciting time. And then another layer is the stark disparity between the wealth of the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which have this hunting club high up on in the Allegheny Mountains, and they have the lake that caused the flood. They did not manage it well. They knew its flaws, and they wanted it to remain as is for better fishing. So there's the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Fricks, all the wealthy barons of industry and economics from Pittsburgh who are up there. And then you've got the immigrant workers in Johnstown, very blue collar. So there's this really stark disparity, and the mountain really plays that up too, at the top of the hill and at the bottom in the foothills of that mountain. And then again, with the unidentified drown, it's heartbreaking and it's very compelling. And then with each one, there is an associated possible narrative, because these are people with plans and dreams who, they never happened because of that unattended mountain lake, where the flood that caused the main part of the flood. So that's the most compelling element that really, this book has been in me for, like with Marion, many, many, many years. And it's a book that I knew that someday that I had to write. So that's why I wrote it.
Marion, and you?
Well, it's so funny how many similarities there are with Barbara and myself in our approach. Both of us are writing about stories that have been forgotten or lost or never known. I learned about the Ross Sea men on a river rafting trip in the Grand Canyon from a friend, and the story stuck with me. Of course, I knew about Shackleton, but I went to the museum in Chicago. They had a special exhibit of Shackleton, and I looked everywhere for information about the Ross Sea men, and again, nothing. I went to the gift shop, no books about the Ross Sea men, and I knew there were books because I had them from the library. So I wrote the director of the museum complaining that the Ross Sea men had again been forgotten. I never got an answer, and I guess the story just bugged me. And then Melissa Mueller wrote a wonderful book about the Shackleton side of the story called Into the Ice, or What the Ice Gets, beg your pardon, What the Ice Gets. And I saw that she had written it in the voices of persona of the men, and I thought, there's the way to write the story. And so I began. And I think it probably took a couple of years to get it, but I was really glad to answer with the second half of the story and get it out there.
And how did you do your research, Marion? And then I'm going to ask the same question to Barbara.
Mm-hmm. Well, I began with books that had been written, especially one particular book, The Forgotten Men, which I have a copy of. It is all worn out with notes in the margins and things circled and underlined. But then I went to online images. I went to the Polar Museum. I got as much information I could. I found online the actual journals that the men kept, which was so helpful to understand their vocabulary and the little petty disagreements between them. And it really helped me give voice to them. And I researched Ancestry.com for information about the commander's wife, Gladys, and what she would be like, and for images and pictures, which helped me get in the heads of these men. And then I had to research a whole bunch about, these huts and the ship and how the ship worked and ice. I read I could show you the big fat book about ice, but I read a whole book about Antarctica and the ice. And, I loved all of that. That wasn't work. That was just fun, and probably held me back from writing because it was just, more information.
Barbara, how about you?
Well, research was a big part of this for both of us. And I was really fortunate to be able to get primary material through the Flood Museum in Johnstown. I had an inn, and then also the memorial site there. So I was really lucky to be able to go back into the artifact rooms and read letters from that time that were archived. There were boxes and boxes and boxes of objects and newspaper clippings, and it was such a wealth that it was almost overwhelming. The really moving parts of doing this research is the personal objects. So wire rim glasses, a glove, a shoe, a doll, that were found after the flood. So each of these, there's a story for each of these too. So it was very powerful just to handle those and to read those letters, diaries. And then the most significant was being able to go through the actual original morgue book of 1889, which is this huge cloth bound kind of a ledger and archived by the National Park Service. And I had to wear the special gloves, and I was supervised by a park ranger. And it's beautiful with this, gorgeous script of, the 1800s, the handwriting, the cursive was beautiful. And that was really compelling. And that's where I got probably the majority of my inspiration was from the morgue book. And that really kind of directed the focus of the book too. It's the voices of the victims that were all described in there. And the descriptions are, the purpose of the descriptions was to help people identify their loved ones, because the disfigurement and the ravage to the bodies was horrible. So the descriptions would be what was in the pocket that might be an identifier, what jewelry, what clothing, what facial features, tattoos, anything that could, rough age, rough weight, that could help identify them. These descriptions were tags that were put on the coffin lid at these makeshift morgues, and people would just wander through the aisles of the morgue reading these descriptions on the coffin tag, and it was just a jar, so you couldn't see the person, the body inside. And if you recognized it, then the person in charge of the morgue would come and move back the coffin lid. So that was the purpose of those morgue descriptions. And from those, for example, if the morgue description said rough hands, coarse clothing, one said she looked like she worked about a stove, she became the scullery maid. Or calloused knees, square jaw, impressions from a hobnail boot in the foot, that became a carpenter. So the figures in the book are created from these morgue descriptions. So they were real people, but they're invented people in the book.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting, I think, with your book, Barbara, that, you were inventing people, whereas Marion had historical people.
Right.
And so how did you change their voices? I mean, obviously they had to have different voices. You had male, female, young, old, how did that work? And same question to Marion too, if you want to chime in together.
Well, there are a lot of voices, and that's one of the advantages of writing a docu-lyric, is all these different points of view. So the carpenter and the drifter and the town doctor, they all have very distinct points of view. And I don't know how you just, with any persona, for anyone who's written persona poem, you just have to really inhabit that figure that you're imagining, or that whether it's a real figure or imaginary. Like Clara Barton is in this, and I developed her voice. I think there are 3 poems in Clara's voice. I read about her. I read her nephew wrote a biography of her. I read her letters to Mary Baker Eddy. She was a woman who never spoke in conditional voice. Nothing is maybe or I might. Everything was very definite. She was a force to be reckoned with, and very authoritarian, described as mulish. So I took on that voice. So that was one way to come up with those different voices. But the research, is I had to know, if I'm talking about a carpenter, what kind of nails did they use then? I don't want to, if you're going to describe something from a different time period or a different culture, you better be accurate. It's a thick shank nail. It's not, a penny nail. Or what are the fruit cultivars of that time? If I have a bowl of fruit on the table, they've got to be the cultivars that were available in Western Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. Or the clothing. I had a Sears catalog from 1900. So I could talk about the clothing and the material, and so that kind of thing. And then, Google, Google is our friend. You just, look up something in Google and you get a wealth of information. That's the easy breezy way to do it. So. Thanks.
For me, for the voices, of course, I didn't have to invent anybody's except Gladys. She's a real person, was a real person, but I didn't have any letters from her or recordings of her voice like I had Richard Richards or journal entries. So I used mostly my imagination, and always writing Gladys's voice, her persona poems in a triolet form helped me enormously. The triolet became my way in to Gladys. So every time you see Gladys enter, she's speaking in triolet. And then Ernest Joyce was fun to write because he's just a cranky guy, and I could distinguish him from, say, Ernest Wild, who was always the positive one, the kind of come on men. He got irritated with the commander, of course, but I had the commander Aeneas and I had Joseph Stenhouse. Both of these are naval officers, and Ernest Joyce and Ernest Wild are seamen. And so you had to distinguish between their rank. And of course, the naval officer Aeneas and Joseph were both Scottish. Ernest, Joyce, and Wild were English. But then you had this Anglican minister whom everyone said he never complained. The man was ill and on death's door for 40 days, and they dragged him all that time, and he never complained. And Cambridge scholar, very tall, very proper. I grew up in the Anglican church myself, so I understood the guy. And so I always had Spencer Smith speaking in sonnets so that you would recognize him, and the formality of the sonnet seemed right for him. And Victor Hayward, the dear guy, a 27-year-old guy from England who's on a big adventure, left his fiancée. And Victor became my person, my thread through this story, who disintegrated, essentially. So finding the voice of the characters was a challenge, but also wonderful as a writer who likes persona. I hope I answered the question.
I think that's good.
Okay.
You know, when we write collections, and you know, there's always poems that we deem worthy and ones that don't quite make the final manuscript. But I'd like to know if there was one poem or a series of poems that you felt were absolutely necessary for the book. And if you'd like to read particularly one poem, we're going to get to another part of this program, everyone, where I've asked each of them to read about 5 poems, so you get a flavor of the book. But maybe you'd like to talk about how do you keep that one poem you absolutely feel is necessary, and what poem that might be. Barbara, you
Barbara.
I'd say the poem that is the last poem in the book, called "I Washed into the World." Really, it went through a lot of revisions, but it was really the necessary one for me, because this person, who is also invented, was born on the night of the flood. And it's a very dramatic story, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but there was one building that's still standing, Alma Hall, which was like a brotherhood of the something or other, you know, I forget what it was. But anyway, tall building, and because it was so tall, the wave that came through Johnstown, the wave was split by the steeple and the church, and part of that wave went right on either side of Alma Hall. So Alma Hall was the building that was spared, because the steeple just did this, like, part of the wave. And this character in this poem, "I Washed into the World," was born in Alma Hall that night. You know, her mother was, you know, gave birth, and she survived, as far as I know. I mean, that was the information that I got. So she really has been in the book the whole way through, you know, in utero in the beginning, and then the end, she comes back on the 50th year commemoration. So I'd be glad to read that one. And it ends the book also, I think, on a kind of a hopeful note. I washed into the world. I washed into the world on the sodden mattress that floated my pregnant mother into the second-story window of Alma Hall. In the pitch blackness of that shivering night, I am told the contractions came on full force, her screams of pain likely drowned out by the shouts and sobs of 200 some terrified and injured in that same room, by the wind's sharp howl, the incessant crash and splinter of buildings, bodies, God knows what, outside. Standing here now in front of Alma Hall, I gaze up to the second floor watermark, the elliptical arches like raised eyebrows, and conjure some primal memory of being delivered from one floating world into another by a doctor with 3 broken ribs, while 18 feet of water sloshed at the sill. I am told that the Presbyterian church steeple split the wave in two, sending the wall of water to either side of the hall, sparing all but one of those sheltered inside. Over the years, I have pieced together what I've been told about the night of my birth, when a flood leveled the city of Johnstown, a patchwork of story and surmise. On my 50th birthday, I've returned to see the lanterns lit along the stone bridge, to visit the ground where my ancestral home folded into itself like an envelope. I have come to visit the plot of the unknown drown at Grandview Cemetery and run my hand along the arc of every blank stone. You have to forgive me. This is a really, the whole story is so moving to me. Yeah.
And to us, Barbara.
Yeah, thanks.
Marion, do you have a similar poem or?
Well, here's what I'll say. When I first wrote Ice Hours, I entered it to a number of competitions the year before it won, and it was a runner-up at Michigan State. And the editor wrote and said, you know, you're runner-up, you should resubmit next year. I think, okay. But I thought, well, maybe I better take a look at the manuscript. And I cut an entire section off at the end, a lot of poems. And then it won. So it was a good decision. But one of the poems that I lost was a long poem in the voice of Richard Richards, 60 years later, remembering this blizzard, this horrible blizzard where they had to leave Ernest Wild back in a tent with 2 men who were dying, while the others tried to get supplies, get back and get again back to the tents. And it was an impossible job to get to the hut, find the supplies. The men were starving, and then haul the supplies back. In the blizzard, they couldn't find them. It was awful. But when Richards remembered it, I heard his voice recorded, his 60. And he's remembering how awful that was and his respect for Ernest Wild, who had nothing to eat for days and kept those 2 men alive against all hope. And so I had to put in this poem on page 73 called Richards. It's a short poem, but it had to go back in. When I think of Wild, that sterling fellow, how he came out after all those days where we'd left him without a crumb to look after the Padre and Mac, to see him pick up his harness and come a distance to meet us, give us a hand. I cannot name my feelings.
Oh.
60 years later, the man choked up on a tape, remembering that moment. So I put that poem back in. It had to be there.
Yeah, and along, Kathleen, with that question are the poems that had to be in, and then some that, as Marion mentioned, also needed to be cut. There were, I tried to write poems in the persona of Carnegie and, you know, Mellon and those folks. And it started feeling accusatory because they, you know, they neglected the lake repairs to the lake that caused the dam to break. I did get a few clubhouse people in there, but they were sympathetic characters. And then the other poems that I simply couldn't write were ones that had to do with when the river caught fire at the stone bridge. People were washed down. They just washed down the river. They're on top of like rooftops and they're hanging onto like mattresses, and it's just crazy. But then the stone bridge, all the debris hit the bridge, and the bridge stopped it. So there was like a, like a pile, I forget how many feet high, but it was enormous. And then a cook stove fell into the water and all that oil caught fire. And there was barbed wire in the water, and people were like, can you imagine how gruesome? And people burned to death. It was like a cauldron. And I couldn't write any poems about that because it's too gruesome. It's so horrible that I couldn't even describe it. Yeah. And I wouldn't want anyone to try to imagine it, which is what we do when we read something, is try to imagine that experience or viewing that experience. So there were some things that I just simply decided not to write about that could have fit in here, or that I just simply, because of how devastating the information was, I couldn't.
Well, one of the things we haven't even touched on yet is how the two of you work together on your books, and the fact that you're first readers and close collaborators in certain ways. So why don't we move into that little happier subject area, perhaps, too? And so either one of you lead off. I don't care.
Well, Marion and I met we figured it was 2018. And we were introduced to each other via Karen Schubert, whom most of you know, who is the head of, she is Lit Youngstown. And Marion had just moved here from Michigan and didn't know a lot of poets. So Karen introduced us online, then we met, and we discovered that we were both working on very similar books, these two books, and that we both had poems in the voice of, in Marion's case, the ice, and in my Antarctica, in my case, the water had a voice, more so than it did in the final revision. And then we decided, and then COVID hit. But in the meantime, we started this peer review, peer support of every week, new poem. And we would
every week. We didn't use Zoom or anything. We weren't fancy. I would email her my poem. She would email me hers, and we would write comments and return them back. And then we would read our poems aloud to each other and offer suggestions. And often we talked about individual poems, and then we talked about how we were structuring the book, which morphed and changed over time. And we were wonderful sounding boards for each other. We had similar challenges. How can we keep this straight for a reader to follow the characters, and how often should the voice of the water or Antarctica come in, and should we use flashbacks or not? I mean, so many common issues that was wonderful to have a person to bounce ideas back and forth. So it was fantastic. It's how Ice Hours came to be, because Barbara, and we both held each other's feet to the fire. Okay, so what do you got for me this week?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful.
And, I agree. And this book wouldn't be this book without Marion's input.
And Ice Hours the same. Yeah.
So I want each of you to read your favorite poem, which I know is hard to choose from the others collection. And then I'm going to have each of you read about five poems from your own collections. So Barbara, why don't you lead off on Marion's book? What was your favorite poem?
Well, it really was hard to narrow this down because I love so many of them. And by the end of this process, I loved all the guys.
Thank you.
I love those guys. And the fact that they were real and that they actually did this incredibly heroic, strenuous, rigorous, really a sacrificial kind of expedition just is so moving. But the poem that I chose is in the beginning of the book, called Penguins and Whales. And it's in the voice of Victor Hayward on the ship. And it's really, I think of this as the calm before the storm. It's so beautiful. This poem takes you onto the deck of the ship, really with Hayward. And he's addressing his fiance. He's 27, newly engaged, and just full of wonder before the really hard stuff happens. Penguins and Whales. Victor Hayward, January 1915. We've entered the Ross Sea. This morning, the captain was fair excited, thinking we'd found a piece of land unmarked on the sea charts. It was an iceberg 5 miles long. There are whales in the water lanes, whales everywhere. Hundreds, big groups of them circle near. If only I could show you a great blue whale, Ethel. As it comes to the surface, it's a Goliath, like an island rising to life. Spencer Smith tried for a photograph, but the blue whale sounded, slowly pouring its great body down to the deeps. I stood a good while after, thinking it was a dream. You'd laugh to see penguins. They glide in the water, elegant and swift, then pop, nimble as Jack be quick, back onto ice and wobble around like 10 pins. Seals beyond counting loll on the floes, lazy gray sausages with puppy eyes. I made a sketch for you. I watched a skua bird attack a shearwater for its squid. It landed on the other bird's head, biting, batting it with its wings until he could pirate away the prize. Just now, we're sailing by an iceberg that's all over green, glowing like polished jade. The sky is changing from rose to violet and orange, and oh, someone's put Caruso on the gramophone. I haven't words to describe this. Even old Joyce and Mac stand together, staring.
Thank you, Barbara.
Beautiful, beautiful.
The note about Caruso is true, that happened. And I have an image of the sketches that Victor made for his intended. Yeah, so thank you, Barbara. Well, I'm going to choose from all of the wonderful, wonderful poems in Barbara's book, Little Shaver, which is on page 65 if you have a copy. I like this one. Well, I like so many. I love so many, but I fall in love with Little Shaver. He's a young boy that she has created. And I have 2 sons. And this poem for me really captures that 9-year-old boy. Little Shaver, morgue entry, male, 9 years old, black hair, short pants with a small bottle in pocket, watch, hatchet, lead pencil, shoe buttoner. On the doorstep of my 9th summer, I was all hepped up from the Decoration Day parade, the reed band, prancing horses, flags, a fleet of steam cars puffing their glory into the crowd. Later, it rained and rained like God was wringing out his laundry over the town. I didn't mind the rising water, not at first. It was like living on a creek bed. I caught all manner of squiggly fellow in the hair tonic bottle Pop gave me and copied their shapes in my notebook. Thought I'd maybe discover something new. Mom cautioned me about straying far from the yard with the creek flowing over. But Sam and Henry were heading up to the old wooden bridge across Toby Creek, keeping tabs on the storm. We leaned over the rail, howling into the roar of water getting higher and higher, flowing at full chisel till it snatched us right up and dumped us in the swirl. We landed on a pile of timber washed down from the yard up at Mineral Point and went flying. It was the wildest ride I have ever been on, like a fantasy not even Jules Verne could dream up. Houses turned inside out with tables and stoves and windows spinning and rooftops rushing by with people riding them, hanging on to chimneys, shouting, reaching out their hands. For a time, I thought I was having some wild dream. I wanted so bad to please wake up. They found me, barefoot and staggered looking, washed up in a garden, pale and delicate as a gardenia, some lady said. Well, I never thought of myself as no flower, but I'm grateful, she thought tenderly of me. My bottle and lead pencil they found in one pocket, my new shoe buttoner in the other.
Thank you, Marion.
Oh,
I know.
so lovely and sad. So we're going to move into asking you now to each read from your collections. Barbara, I'll have you go first. There's about 5 poems, is that right?
Yes. I will read a couple of poems from The Voice of the Water, the books in 4 sections, and the poet speaker. I have a poem that introduces each section, and they're the only ones that are in the poet's I voice. And then also with those is The Voice of the Water that goes along with introducing each section. So I'll read a couple of those. Initially, they were all one, it was all one poem. And then in the end, I divided them into 4 sections to introduce, 4 poems to introduce each section. 1, Rain. I possess neither mind nor heart, but run with memory beyond the arc. Its great animal commotion, I am created to spill. What I try to capture with these is the indifference of the water. It doesn't matter that that it's taking lives. It just does what it's intended to do. And I'll read one more of the water poems. Carry. Only so much I can collect before my body becomes reliquary. Crucifix, brick, trolley coin, serving spoon, old men, children, I gather all forged of tin or flesh in sheets of silt and ruin. So that voice of the water goes through the book too with each section. Let me read The Drifter. This is one that was a figure that was unidentified, and the morgue entry is male, 30 years, open-faced silver watch, 1 knife, 1 rule, 1 toothbrush, 1 lead pencil, book of rates, ELAS, 1,000-mile pass book. And that's a railway ticket book. Okay, The Drifter. So here's the design. Hop the Pennsylvania line at East Conemaugh, then on upstate to the Erie, New York, all the way into St. Louis, change to the Frisco, west, where the outlook opens wide, blue skies, sea-washed air. Yes, sir, the Iron Horse, my way out of this smoke-choked town, sick to death of my skin crawling with dust, crunching soot in my sleep. Anyways, no job, no family, nothing here to root me. I'm carrying everything a fella needs to strike out. My father's silver timepiece, valuable as my 1,000-mile pass, good as gold in my pocket. A knife, of course. What man worth his whiskers doesn't carry some sort of blade? A rule, a pencil, a book of rates. How many hot meals, tobacco plugs, shoe shines, miles? Got it figured. Exacting, down to the 1/8 inch, the last copper. That's me. Rain still lashing this morning like a coach whip, a dark mist arcing over the hill, like some fine black powder spewing straight out of the ground. Best hightail it toward the station. What now? That ear-splitting thunder, some fearsome rumble, booming down the mountainside. So this is the moment just before the wave comes. And for every letter that I wrote or description, it was like an explosion. It was very, very loud. And piercing, and it just sounded like more like an earthquake than a wave. So that's my drifter. And one of my favorite figures in this book is the telegrapher Emma Ehrenfeld. So she appears 3 times in the book. And the telegraphers along the railway line were really important. And of course, that was along the river as well, and the river overflowed. And they keep track of everything. So the telegrapher appears throughout the book. On hearing John Hess's engine whistle. And let me say a word about John Hess. He was a train engineer who was famously known to sound his whistle and warn everybody that the flood was coming. So this is Emma Ehrenfeld, telegrapher, South Fork Tower, 3:08 p.m., May 31st, 1889. Any operator worth her salt can read a train whistle by ear. The pitch, the tune, the duration declares which conductor, what message, the urgency. At the first of Hess's 5 sharp whistle blasts, we know in our very bodies that danger is upon us. The conductor and I spring in unison from our chairs, me without even grabbing my hat, then fly at a great lick down the tower stairs. One glance up the hillside reveals a rick-rack wall of timber, rooftops, Lord knows what else, gathering up everything in its path. I bolt across 4 sets of tracks and up the stairs of the cold tipple. The water's roar joined with that mournful whistle shriek. My ears still ring with it. The dam that threatened year after year has failed in spectacular fashion. 4 more blasts before Hess ties down his whistle, a scream anyone within earshot can decipher. Within minutes, the wave uproots the entire tower. I look away when it happens. Later, I find among the debris my telegraph key, that old vacuum brewer, and the faithful depot clock, once affixed atop the tower like a full moon. Its hands stopped cold at 3:08. And as far as I know, Emma Ehrenfeld survived the flood. I think she lived into a grand old age. And I'll read a Clara Barton poem. Clara Barton appears in the last 2 sections of the book, and she comes in and really saves the day. Clara Barton reports from the field, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, September 9th, 1889. Half my life has been spent in motion, and so it is fitting I conduct my field work from this abandoned boxcar. What do I need beyond a wooden crate for a desk, milking stool for a chair, my spine a sufficient backrest? 3 months now since the Great Flood, and already we've built housing for scores of homeless, running water both cold and hot. No person in need of clothing or food is left empty-handed. Thanks to my nurses, the typhus is contained. If only we could heal broken spirits. I trust time will do its best work there. Never have I been prouder to see the Red Cross banners flying above our white tents. General Hastings has proved a worthy partner. I recall our first meeting in June when ankle deep in muck, hatless, doubtless disheveled, I stood surveying the devastation when he swung down from his horse and offered his hand. Dear woman, may I assist you? I had to hide my smile. At the end of a long day, I prize the night's silence. Let the visions of wreckage, the bewildered faces fall away. I stretch out on a cot, narrow as myself, and feel the fatigue in these old limbs. Glad for clean bedding and a woolen blanket this rainy night. I shall not leave until my work here is finished. Daily the town rebuilds, home by home, shop by shop. Smoke from the Gautier steelworks will rise again like Lazarus, having nothing whatever to do with miracles. It has to do with Clara. And then the last poem I will read is in the voice of John Hess. And this is 1906, so that's a number of years later when he is an old man. John Hess's last day, East Conemaugh, 1906. The river still rises in my dreams, and we fly down the tracks just ahead of the wave that engulfed the city. I race my engine breakneck, sounding that long whistle all the way, then startle awake, sweated and elated. Somehow my whole crew survived. My engine was later restored. I never would have believed it possible after seeing her tumbled on her side with the other cars like a bunch of dead cows. After 17 years, I close my eyes to this sick room and clear as my own wife's face remember, swinging up to the cab next to the fireman, checking the gauges and valves, seeing a good fire in the box, the gleam of the steel rail ahead. I was one with that engine, my hand on the throttle, feeling the shudder of power beneath me, steaming her down the line. Now I hear a distant train's moan and chuff. If only I could rise from this bed, walk to the window, watch the white blast of steam, the progress of engine, coach, caboose, like wind around the mountain bend. Thank you so much. This is the first time I've read these actually since the book came out, so I'm happy that you were here as my first audience. Thanks.
So good.
Marion, you're up.
Okay. Well, I'll read 5 as well. And the first one I'll read is The Race to Minna Bluff. Kathleen had some input on these because, you know, when you try to pick poems to read, it's hard, but I'm happy to read this one. This will give you a little bit of a sense of the job and the attitude of some of the men toward each other. The job was they loaded these sledges with food and supplies, and then they had to take them to certain points they'd figured out. And they were going to put the crates under blocks of snow or ice and then put a big flag on top, hoping Shackleton would see it. It was a grueling job, and usually the teams were 3 men and 3 dogs, and all were pulling, the men and the dogs. The men had harnesses for most of the time, unless they had a good wind, they could put up a little sort of sheet as a sail, it helped them. And sometimes the dogs could do it. But mostly the men were hauling 300 pounds apiece, not to mention what the dogs were hauling. And the first big marker was Minna Bluff. The Race to Minna Bluff, in the voice of Ernest Joyce. This was February 1915, the first season. 7 miles in 3 days, but by God, we're on the barrier now and moving. Max promised a magnum of champagne for the team to reach the bluff first, his joke. We've a routine. The 3 of us travel by day. Mac's team passes us by night as we rest. Yesterday, Wild left another message in the snow. It read, "Pub ahead." Today we found Jock, Mac's lead dog, tethered to a pole with some seal meat and a snow shelter. I suppose Mac intended to pick him up in a few weeks on his way back. I see he's been knocking the hell out of him. Mac hasn't any damned idea how to manage dogs. I harness Jock up and he pulls splendidly for us. The temperature's dropped. It's bitter cold, but smoother for sledging. Every 1.5 miles we stop and build a snow cairn to mark our way back. The barrier's vast as a frozen sea. Sometimes there's ice waves, tall peaks of Strasjugi we battle up time and again. There's a strange stillness on the barrier, a quiet broken only by the shush of our runners. We march on, lost in our thoughts. Mack and Smithy quote the Plumy poets, but no one puts it better than Robert Service. He lived a time in the Yukon, so he knew. The white land locked tight as a drum, the cold fear that follows and finds you, the silence that bludgeons you dumb. The last three lines are Robert Service, and I loved that Ernest Joyce was a fan of Robert Service's poetry because my grandfather was as well. And he was of this time period. And I have a book of Robert Service poems that were my grandfather's, so I was happy to be able to use that. Nicely, Kathleen asked me to read one of the particular Antarctica ones, and I found Antarctica's voice because I had moved to Ohio. I didn't know anybody. I was lonesome. And then COVID hit. I was more lonesome. And so if Antarctica's voice sounds lonesome, it's because I was when I was writing this. Learning detachment, Antarctica. I think of the small one, India, when the night is so black, it pulls outward like a riptide. Her shape once nestled warm against me. We jostled like pack ice, bumped, and then drifted apart. Africa's great muscular body embraced South America until they broke up. Australia simply rafted off. There is no language for what I want. I do not long for them, but something calls me out there in the night. In the dark, the whole crevasse of space glinting, it helps to remember how South America lingered, her peninsula locked fingertip to fingertip with mine, holding on until bit by bit we slipped. And cold and alone, I fell away. So I'll read three more. I'd like to read The Men Asleep at the Bottom of the World. I don't often get a chance to read this one. It's a cento. For those of you who write poetry know that I didn't really write this. I assembled it. These are lines from other poets. These are the Plumy poets, obviously. And I chose lines from the poets who were all writing in that time period, and they were writing about World War I. So Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, D.H. Lawrence. I chose lines because I wanted my men to be asleep at the end of the second season. They've done the job. They're exhausted. And I wanted lines because I was imagining what each of these men would dream of. What would the commander dream of? What would the padre dream of? What would Victor dream of? So this is a cento written in the place of Hut Point, Antarctica, 1916. Fumbling, drunk with fatigue, the men totter toward rest, lay shuddering, sleep. Darkness, breaths of green, aqueous, floating, queer green light streaming as under a green sea. And someone dreamed green leaves, grass, the sweet hush after the talk of birds. Someone moaned, dreaming of the benison of hot water, clean sheets, clean beds, the cool kindliness of sheets. Someone stirred, shifting his body, heard softly a woman singing, remembered a child under the piano, a mother who smiles as she sings. Things with balls and bats, old Sunday evenings at home, children at the table, simple, homely crust of friendly bread and many tasting food, white plates and cups, clean gleaming, ringed with blue. Hair's fragrance, the scent of limes in bloom, in the flowing dress, tenderness, the throb and ache, the thumping heart, come back, come back. And the astonishment of bustling life, bank holidays, picture shows, and spats, going to the office in the train, the deep panting train, falling seeds of rain, water dippling, deeps of melting blue and green water, dreams flicker, fade, dwindle as the wave goes home. And this heart, where glory burns, slept. And this heart, lost among the stars, slept. This heart, drifting, dipped, contented oars, sighed, and slept. So a lot of people like Gladys, and she appears a few times. Of course, she has no idea of what's happening with her husband. No idea. There's no way of getting information. Likely she would have heard when Shackleton was, well, I'm certain she was heard when Shackleton was finally rescued, but he didn't even know what was happening with the raw seamen. And at this time period, of course, most of the men in England were off at war in France. So telegrams would come down the street and inform people of losses at the front in the war.
You want a piece of fruit, Ted?
This is Gladys Mackintosh in the Garden, Bedford, England, August 1916. These days, if the chemist boy pedals down the lane, curtains brush back, and we all wonder who will read. I regret to inform you, it gives me great pain. So today, when the chemist boy turns down our lane, I rise from the roses, shield my brow and strain to see his face. Perhaps he's delivering a tonic. It isn't true. I can see it's a telegram, the boy's pedaling down the lane. Every curtain's brushed back. In a moment, we'll know who. And I'll end on a happy poem, which is Ship Ho, when by unbelievable seamanship of Joseph Stenhouse, he kept the Aurora afloat for 9 months, got to land. They refitted her. She was a wreck, lost her, she was a wreck, but they went back. Shackleton was not allowed to be the commander of that ship at that time to do the rescue, nor was Joseph Stenhouse. They didn't want those men to be the commander. Captain John King Davis was chosen as the man to sail the Aurora back. Shackleton was allowed to be on board, but he had no role as in the hierarchy of seamanship. The men now are at Cape Evans, which is the better of the two huts. It at least has insulation, it has bunks, it has furniture, it has a stove. It's primitive, but they can make it fairly comfortable. But they had, very little hope of anybody coming for them. Ship Ho, Cape Evans, morning of January 10, 1917. Richards sees it first. It materializes from the mist as he holds the glasses to his eyes, scanning for seals. A drifting berg, he thinks, until a curl of smoke rises from it into the northern sky. At the breakfast table, he passes a quiet word to Joyce, who goes to the high window. Standing on a box, Joyce peers across the frozen sound to the spot 9 miles off. Blinks. Then he shouts, "Ship! Ho!" A clatter of crockery, scraped chairs, cries and calls, backs clapped, a confusion of what to grab first, so they grab each other, quaking, grip hands, and shake hard. The outline of the ship sharpens as they dash toward it with dogs and loaded sledges. It can't be. It is. They whoop their joy, recognizing the Aurora. Joyce beams with the binoculars held tight to his eyes. A mile or so across the ice, three small figures, like penguins, materialize, come toward them. And he knows, is dead sure, one of the figures walks exactly like Shackleton. "Joyce, old man, I am more than pleased to see you." And there he is, the boss, large as life, standing here, hand extended. In such a moment, perhaps nothing seems quite real, but the mind may just crack open enough to allow a narrow glimpse of something warm, something clean. The men are filthy. They've worn the same clothes for more than 2 years. The stench of their bodies is fierce. Wild-eyed, manic, they burble, blurt a frenzy of words, hoot, weep. Jack, too overcome to leave the hut, remains fluttering inside, fussing, petting his things. How many men have we lost? Once the boss is told about McIntosh and Hayward, about Spencer Smith, Shackleton sends the prearranged signal to Captain John King Davis on the Aurora, who instantly understands 3 men perished when Shackleton and his 2 shipmates move apart and all 3 lie down flat on the ice. Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it so much.
It has no way to communicate.
So I'd like to open, Kathy Essinger, can you put yourself on mute?
Mute.
Mute. Anyway, I'd like to open it for questions. I think it would be fine if you just want to unmute and ask your question rather than worry about the chat. Although I see, let's see, somebody, oh, just thanks. Okay. All just lovely. Thanks. Lovely.
Oh,
wonderful. But why don't we open it up for questions?
I've got one.
Okay.
And
Well, first of all, thank you both for this wonderful program. I ordered both books this morning.
Oh, thank you, Ken.
Just on the descriptions of what they were going to be about. Excuse me. I'm very interested in other poets who are writing about historical figures and historical events. That's an interest of mine as well. My question is, what other antecedent poetic books did you know about or look at before writing your own? This is a fairly small genre that you're working in. And for Marion's book, I can certainly think of Elizabeth Bradfield's Approaching Ice. She did this book about the polar explorers. And of course, for Barbara, there's Edgar Lee Masters, you know, the Spoon River Anthology. But were there other poetic books of historic interest and figures that you considered?
Well, Melissa Muller's What the Ice Gets was pivotal for me. And then, you know, I have been reading along the way, and Barbara and I have actually presented about the doculyric and the number. There are actually more than you realize, but I had seen Out of the Dust, which was written about the dust storm in the persona of a young girl living at that time in Oklahoma. It's always her voice. So I knew that it was out there. What I didn't know would be how easy these would be to be published. You know, I mean, it's a narrow window, I felt, a subgenre, if you will. Barbara, you want
yeah, thanks for that question, Ken. And we for our presentation, we did 2 presentations recently. We compiled a list, and it is long, of
Mhm.
contemporary books, docu-lyrics. One that I really, well, several I really love. One is Frank X. Walker. He's a poet out of Kentucky. He was the poet laureate. Yeah. So he wrote 2 poems about the Lewis and Clark, or 2 books about the Lewis and Clark expedition. One is in the voice of York, who was a slave taken along with Lewis and Clark on that expedition. And the whole thing is from York's perspective, which I thought was brilliant. And there's another, and one is called York, and I can't remember the name of the other.
I'm familiar with those.
Yeah.
And I would be glad to, if you wish me to put your email down or email me, and I will send you the list that we came up with. If you want a list of the
I'd love to
docu-lyrics.
see that. I know of a
Yeah.
few, like Maurice Manning's Daniel Boone book, you know,
Mhm, mhm,
Companion of Owls.
mhm,
And then there's David Mason's one on Ludlow.
mhm,
There's, you know, there's a few that I'd love to know more. Thank you.
Yeah, be happy to send you that
Right.
list.
And there's
Ken.
the other one that really, really impacted me was Rachel Dilworth's book, The Magdalene Laundries,
Oh, yeah.
where she looks at that phenomenon in Ireland that really went into the 20th century of women who were called like wanton, like not wanton women
Mhm,
who were considered troublesome or a little too flirty, or who got pregnant out of wedlock. And
Mhm.
they were taken to these laundries called the Magdalene Laundries, and they lived their lives just doing laundry and living in
mhm.
this, with these nuns and having their babies, and their babies were whisked away. And it was really powerful. And she did interviews, and everything was in persona. It was really wonderful. So that was a big influence.
There's another one called Mary's Dust, and each one is a persona poem in the voice of a different Mary in history.
Mhm.
There's quite a bit. We'll send you the list.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. Other questions, maybe?
Parrot?
I'd like the list too, but
Oh,
the
sure.
question I have, which I said to Kathleen, I've got a question. I'm really interested that you both had erasure poems, and Barbara, you had more in your book than Marion. But although I saw Fairchild was, one of Marion's erasure poems, my question is, how did you know that those were the poems that you were going to use for your erasure? Where was the intersection of the poems you chose for erasure and the work you were doing in your respective stories? That's my question.
Yeah, and that goes to that whole question of authenticity. Marion talked about using literature and writers of the time, and I tried to do the same thing. So Lizette Woodworth, I think is her name. I used her poems, and she was writing at the time, for my erasure poems. And I made them very small. I used some contemporary, but I tried to stick with writers who were writing at the time. And I didn't know until I was really deep into it, into the manuscript, that I would use, do found poetry. And I also have a cento in the book. And I really like the idea of erasure as, what erasure symbolizes. These people were erased off the face of the earth. So I like that found form in the book.
Yes, I felt like the erasure poems, because of the people being erased, it was just really powerful. I appreciate you saying you use poems from that time period. Yeah.
Yeah, in my case, for The Men Asleep at the Bottom of the World, I just looked for all of the poets writing at the time about World War I. And then selected my lines from there. That was my rule. And that cento, like so many others in the book, the form helped me write the poem. Whether it was the triolet for Gladys, or the sonnet for the Padre, or I did a couple of glosses. The form helped me write the poem.
Yeah, that's very true. If I could just tag on to that, form is really, really helpful when you're trying to find a voice. And the other thing, I used epistolary poems a couple of times, because
I did one.
the individual poems, they talk about a specific moment in time.
Mhm.
or a moment like before the flood, or, you know, coming back from like the voice of from the grave kind of thing. But the epistolary poems can give you the panorama, the
Mhm.
panoramic view of so many things are going on. There's I made up a character named William who's a volunteer from Pittsburgh, who writes to his father and then to his wife about everything that's going on. And so you really get the big picture perspective through an
Mhm.
epistolary poem. So form is a really helpful way to go about historical material.
I would piggyback. I have Stenhouse writing back to his father, and that letter form solved a lot of plot problems for me. I
Right.
was able to put a lot of information into that letter that in a poem would have been kind of clunky. But in the voice of Stenhouse writing to his father, a shipbuilder, about the ship, I was able to put in information about the ship that I didn't know otherwise how to do, you know.
You mentioned a form I wasn't familiar with when you were rattling off your forms.
Glossa.
Yeah, what is that?
Well, I'm gonna let me find an example of the glossa. So left behind Max stay on the ice is a glossa. So a glossa is you have a cabeza, which means there are 4 lines under the title that are from another poet. And in this case, the 4 lines are T.S. Eliot. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing again, nothing. Those 4 lines are my cabeza. Now, the rule of the glossa is that each of those 4 lines in turn ends the stanza. Okay, so my first stanza ends with, what is that noise? My next stanza ends with the wind in the door, right? And then the other rule, I like these rules. People who know me know I'm kind of a rule follower and I like the rules, but there's a rhyme pattern that's required. So noise has to rhyme with the second to the last line and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, the 6th line. So the 6th, the second to the last and the last lines in a stanza all have to rhyme. The stanza has an exact number of lines. Now, I had read wrongly that I thought the 3rd line also had to rhyme. So my 3rd, 6th, and second to the last and last lines all rhyme. That's a glossa. And I did that for Max, that poem, and I did it for White Earth and Ruins. Again, using D.H. Lawrence. Again, I'm insisting upon myself using poets from the time period. So that was a harder one because I had to write words like nullity and verity, but I kept at it.
And I wrote a glossa too, I think on Marion's
I probably made her do it.
and she held me to that extra rhyme rule. So you have to do that extra, that rhyme. And so anyway, it's also it wasn't over the top because we threw in an extra rule.
Poem is yours, Barbara.
Pardon me?
Which one is your glossa?
It is the park, the engineer. And I use Emily Dickinson's, this is the Hour of Lead. Let me find it.
That's right. That's right. The neat thing about a glossa is you're already leaning on something else. You've got a starting point. It creates a pattern for you. It creates a scaffolding or a structure that's so helpful.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh,
No.
just to answer Karen's question, it's As the Storm Bears Down on page 32. And I use Emily Dickinson's from her poem 372. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. So each of those lines ended this stanza.
Diane, you wanted to say something?
I want a question. Isn't the glossa originally a Spanish form? It may just be the first one I read was Spanish.
That sounds familiar to me. I would not want to say authoritatively, but I think I think you might be right. Yeah.
The first one I ever read was Spanish, so that may be the idea. But I will say, rhyming is so much easier in Spanish. So if you came across that rule, you know, it's so much easier in Spanish than it is in English.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Well, when you said the top part was cabeza, that's head in Spanish.
Yes.
So it sounds like it could
Probably,
all
yeah,
be.
that makes sense, yeah.
That's right, Kathleen. Good point.
So why the glossa? Why did you choose the glossa for the poems you did? I'm curious about that.
Those were hard ones to write about. They were critical points, men dying, and I needed, for example, Left Behind when Mac is on the ice. He's going mad from illness and isolation and starvation. And that's hard to write just straight out. You know, what does a guy sound like when he's going a little bonkers, right? And so I knew T.S. Eliot's Wasteland was obviously helpful in getting that idea across. And I tried different segments of Wasteland, but this idea of him hearing a noise that isn't there, that it becomes mysterious, was my way in. I needed Mac to be a little crazy, hearing things, thinking he hears Shackleton, thinking he hears his wife. So that's why.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just thinking about Adrienne Rich saying that what form does for you is it gives you like oven mitts to handle really hot topics. And what you're saying is sort of the glossa are the thickest mitts in your tool chest right there.
I had never heard that, but I really like that idea of the glossa being the oven mitts. And White Earth and Ruins is the same kind of awfully difficult poem where they're just stuck in that tent. And again, it's these men in isolation, slowly dying, slowly losing hope. And how do you write about that? And of course, D.H. Lawrence is writing about the men in the war, feeling the same thing. So it was a way in. It was my oven mitts.
Right. It's a way in. I think that's a good answer. That would be my answer. That, you know, and I happen to love this particular Emily Dickinson poem, and it's got the same tenor of the whole book.
Tenor is a good word.
Yeah.
Good word. Yeah.
Cora?
Hello.
Hi, Cora.
Nice to hear you and to hear you read these beautiful poems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, I noticed that you both wrote about forms of water and the power they can unleash. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
About the fact that we both were writing about that?
That you chose water and its power.
In some ways, my first thought, and I know this is kind of woo-woo, but it's kind of like synchronicity. When Marion and I met, we were both writing similar kind of books, and they both had to do with water and ice, and using those elements, you know, as voices of those. And it was, I don't know. I mean, I just think it was an amazing coincidence, if there is such a thing.
Yeah.
But for the water, I mean, it's elemental to the whole story. That it's all about water. It's the rivers overflowing, the snow melt coming down the mountain from a really snowy year, a fantastic storm of the century from coming over from Kansas, and then the dam bursting. It is just, it leaves you feeling inundated. The whole story does.
I think too, the water in Antarctica and the ice serve the book and serve in Barbara's book for contrast of, you know, the intimate story and then the macro angle. So there's a contrast for the reader. We're in the tent with these guys, or I'm just worried about this one little boy, little shaver. And then there's the whole, you know, macro view of just the water or the continent, and also the contrast of all of these human concerns versus, you know, the disinterest of nature, you know. So these were helpful techniques, if you will, to keep the book interesting and fresh and varied for both of us, I think. And we recognized we were doing that intentionally.
I really like what you say, the contrast between the small and the human and microscopic and the macro world against which we are really helpless.
Right, right. And how we needed to intersperse those in the book to keep the reader engaged, really. Right. Maureen?
This is my first experience hearing how you can take a historic incident, maybe not my first experience, but to take it and to make it into something one wants to read through a poet's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a sense that you each took the story into yourself so deeply that it captivated you.
Mm-hmm.
And you were able to arrive at points of tension.
Mm-hmm.
And the voices, as you talk about the voices, I'm just like struck with the beauty.
Thank you.
Of the ability to do what each of you have done.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Yeah, I don't know that I could do it again.
we were absorbed. You know, it's interesting when Barbara said, I don't think I could do it again. I think the books that I wrote up to this book honed me for the ability to write this book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Does that make sense? I needed to get my skills up. This was demanding. And Barbara, I think, would say the same. It was demanding.
Yeah,
and you felt a responsibility to do it right because this is real stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Maureen. No, pardon me. And authenticity is what we kept striving for, to make everything researched. So if I talked about the 4th of July meal, what did they have on the 4th of July? How did they celebrate? Well, that needs to, I can't just make that. We couldn't make stuff up. I mean, I invented some figures from the morgue description, but everything had to be really nailed down in terms of the authentic information. And I think that helped. I think that helped with the voices too.
I will say something that's happened that the poets and the listening will be interested in. I've been presenting ice hours for historical societies. So I have slides of the men, the ship, the huts, you know, and I do a talk about the Ross Sea men. And then, you know, I intersperse reading about 8 or 9 poems. And I don't say this is a poetry book. I just say, well, let me read you a piece from this, you know, and I read it. And then let me read you a piece to illustrate that. And I read it. And then at the end, they're all like, is this poetry? And I say, yeah. And they say, well, I don't like poetry, but could I buy a copy of your book? And it's so interesting to have that experience too. So if you are going to write historically, Ken, in poetry, there's a whole world, a whole audience out there for you. Michigan State said, well, we've sold several of your copies of your book at fishing and hunting conferences. I'm like, okay, the fishermen and the hunters are buying a book of poetry. Yes, they're very interested in anything to do with Shackleton. So I'm like, okay.
I love the idea that other groups besides, you know, poets and seamen would be interested in what you're doing, and I'm working on that same idea. I had a post-publication question for you. After your book is in print, what did you or your publishers do to get the reviews out there and to get some attention for these collections? Because these aren't mainstream publishers and that sort of thing. And I feel kind of stuck with what I've done and would love to hear how you moved it out and got as far as
Yeah.
you got, which is marvelous.
Thank
Well,
you.
I can, oh, yeah, thank you for that, Ken. Pardon me. I can say that my press, Alternating Current Press, has turned out to be fabulous. They sent out to Kirkus Review, Publishers Weekly. They're like 5, you know, review, you know, like publishing house review places like Kirkus Review, and they automatically send out to those.
Mhm.
So
Very helpful.
that's nice. And then, you know, I think, and other people might have different experiences, then you're kind of on your own to
Mhm.
find what are the resources out there. Or, you know, I think the journals that you publish some of the poems in,
Yes.
one of the journals that I published a couple of the poems in said, sure, we'll write a review. Absolutely. So that's one way to go about it. You know, any poems in your collection that have been published in journals, ask those journals if they do, you know, if they do book reviews. And then there's in Ohio, there's the Ohioana organization, and you can send your book in for a review to them. But
Yeah.
it is, you really have to scan the horizon for places to do that if the publisher doesn't do it for you.
My experience was identical. Michigan State has a publicist and they sent out, and that's how I got in Poets and Writers. But generally speaking, you know, they're busy. They're already, I mean, my book was accepted in 21. It wasn't released till 23. So they got 2 books in the hopper behind me to think about. But I did write to places that published the poems and got response. And Ohioana, I went in the library and saw the Ohioana magazine. I read a couple of the reviews she did, and I wrote to her and said, hey, would you be interested? And she said, absolutely. So you do have to just ask. The most they're going to say is no. And I asked people who said no. I said, you know, if you've got too much on your plate and don't have the bandwidth for this, that's okay. And one person wrote back and said, I really have too much on my plate. And I'm like, okay, you know, you move on. But
Does the Ohioana do only Ohio authors, Ohio books?
Or people who have lived in Ohio or from Ohio, who have some kind of history with Ohio. You don't have to actually live in Ohio.
right.
I know somebody who lived in Ohio, Kathleen. So you know, it's about as close as I'm going to get right now.
Yeah, but then you look in your own state, your own home state. It takes a lot of grunt work, honestly.
It does.
Where?
Mhm.
I have one more question, and this is for Barbara. I mean, Shackleton is a big figure.
Mhm.
What kind of reception have you had of your book in Johnstown?
Mhm.
I'm sorry, Karen, how many what?
Hometown, Johnstown. I mean, what kind of reception have you had? You know, because you did all that work in the historical museum and all that incredible research, and you have walked that cemetery. What kind of reception have you gotten to this book there?
Well, nothing yet, because it just came out in October. So I have on my top of my priority list is to get in touch with the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. I did get in touch with the National Park Service for the memorial site. They said we can't sponsor anything that involves any money. So they can't do anything in terms of like promoting or
They can't put your book in their book. Do they have a bookstore? They can't put it.
not the National Park Service, but there is a flood, the flood site. There are 3 different places. So I have yet to really like go into that whole like market, I guess you could call it. So, but I expect a good reception, because I am on the Facebook site for people from Johnstown and my high school alma mater, and people have, you know, have shown a lot of support that way. But I have to actually get my body there and do some readings, and I think even classrooms. I'm thinking of like going to some of the high schools in Johnstown. This is a great way to learn history. It's not dry, it's not facts and figures, it's people's lives.
Mhm.
So I'm en route, Karen.
Nobody's writing from Antarctica. And it's unlikely that I'll go visit with my books in tow, but you know, Say la
I
vie.
think National Geographic or the Smithsonian and their cruises might be interested, Marion.
I wrote Viking Cruise Line's director and sent him a book. We'll see.
They don't have a poetry round group at McMurdo Station or anything?
You know, there was a poetry group who asked for photographs and poems to talk about the melting of the ice, and All My Flowers was chosen with one of my photographs to be in a big, well, big. It was in Antarctica, so I don't know how big, but in a thing that was supposed to be on the web, and then COVID hit, and it ruined their ability to pull it off. So that was sad. Yeah.
We have just a few more minutes, but if there's any other questions, we're enjoying this conversation so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone being here, and thank you for your patience in terms of entering the Zoom room.
Yeah, I'm very disappointed in Eventbrite's setup. So we're sorry about that.
Is anyone here? Is anyone writing any poetry that has to do with history?
What is your topic, Ken?
I've written a book, an autobiography and poems about the painter Albert Bierstadt. It's called The Best Material for the Right Artist in the World. And it was published last March by Stephen F. Austin State University Press in Texas.
Congratulations. That's
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's historical based, like you guys. I did a lot of persona poems for him and his associates and the other people that are along the trips. But it sort of spans his whole life. It's not as concentrated on a single event or series of events. It's quite as tight as yours. But I'm just trying to get it out there, and it just seems kind of stuck. Trying to get.
Where do you live, Ken?
I'm in Western North Carolina, very close to Kathleen and Karen.
Okay. I recommend you pitch the idea to art galleries, art museums, historical groups that you would come and do a talk. And they love it if you have images to go with. I imagine you might have images of the
I've
art.
done several slideshows already
Yeah.
at various places.
Yeah, that's been extremely successful for me.
And also senior centers.
Senior centers are
We're always looking for
programming, and
Yeah.
they embrace this. They really do.
Is he a painter?
Yes, he's a
So
Western scenery painter.
So do you have ekphrastic poems?
Several, yes.
Okay. Have those been published?
Yeah, almost all the poems in the book were published in periodicals before the book was published. At least 3/4.
I just had and it's been 2 years now, but I had a book about a Spanish painter, and I'm just now getting the book to galleries and museums. My local art museum is carrying it, and I just got a contact with the National Women's Museum in DC, so that's another thing.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear more. This seems a natural for like Park Service and National Forest Service gift shops in places, particularly where Bierstadt painted scenes.
Oh, that's a great idea.
But it's a hard knock getting in their door. That's what I don't really have the clues on. So
yeah, the park services are tricky because they won't do anything or even write a blurb. One of the people I interviewed, he was a great grandson of one of the railway telegraphers during the flood. I mean, he was a interpreter for the Park Service, and he said he's not allowed to do anything like write a blurb, host a reading, anything, because the Park Service won't let you do that if there's any money involved. So
I got the same
right
cold shoulder from the Smithsonian and the Met and the other places which have some outstanding Bierstadt paintings. So still looking.
You'll find your venues.
Thank you.
It takes time.
Yeah.
But none of that goes out of date. All of that's
that's one of the good things. It's not topical in sense of it won't
not going to go out of date.
Next year's old news. It's art.
Yeah,
it stays around.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, history has no shelf life. So
keep plugging and maybe schools.
I just want to say, wow.
Oh, Marion
Mary
Steele.
Steele.
And
Thank you.
the presentation today was just wonderful. I think I'm going back and read them again,
Thank
Oh,
you.
probably very quickly, but they're just wonderful
thank
works.
you so much. Thank
That's very, very flattering. Thank you. Thank you so much.
you a lot.
Thank you, Kathleen, for putting this together and letting us meet
Yes.
these two fine
Oh,
people, learn
absolutely.
about their
A
books.
round of
Yeah.
applause for
Thank you,
Kathleen.
Kathleen. Oh my gosh. This is her brainchild. We're so grateful.
Mhm.
It was a lot of fun.
And Kathleen, you may be doing this again with other authors, correct?
It really inspired me. I mean, I had a great time coming up with interview questions, talking with these two, figuring out, how we might conduct this. And I just encouraged them. I really wanted everybody to hear a lot of the poems. They were like, oh, no. I'm like, no, people want to hear the poems themselves. Let it stand on their own.
It was beautifully put together.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's something I'd
Wonderful.
like to mention. I don't want to slight Miriam's book, but I really was taken with the organization of Barbara's book with the little sections and the
Is it? Yeah.
artwork.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yes, I mean the thought, and that's something that but we're running out of time, is how do you put a collection together, and the organization of the little poems, rain,
Mhm.
and then the longer Antarctica, and then the section just was striking.
Thank you so much. Well, I credit the publisher, the press, Alternating Current, for putting the artwork in there. They put it, the path of the flood, the map in there, and they have little water sprinkles on between the sections on the pages. They did a beautiful job. And I think both Marion and I we organized this chronologically.
Mhm.
Right, so starting with the new 1915, and for me, the year before the flood, 1888, and then all the way through. So with a historical event, I mean, you kind of are, I think it's sensible to follow the chronology. And that helps.
And then I looked at Miriam's map, which isn't going to show up here because it just isn't. But the map, I kept going back to the map and looking where the ships were coming from, and that really was helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, it was so wonderful that both of our publishers allowed us to put maps in, and we had to get permissions and so forth to do that. So, the publishers went out of their way to accommodate us, but without the maps, it's harder, isn't it? Right?
Oh,
to follow the
yeah,
story.
I mean,
Yeah.
I love knowing where the ships were.
Exactly.
I mean, that
Exactly.
really helped on that map.
Yeah. And I have a map, I do a presentation, I have a map of Antarctica with United States superimposed on Antarctica. And people always gasp because Antarctica is larger than the United States.
Sure.
And so then the trail of what the men were trying to do was on, and they're like, oh my God. You always kind of picture Antarctica as kind of okay, and then United States, nope. No. I would have liked to have had that map in there too, but you can't do everything. Thank you all.
We're looking at Kathleen now.
I know. I was just going to say, I really think that we should just thank you all one more time because it was just so wonderful. Marion and Barbara especially, and all of you in the audience. This was it ended up being a much more intimate event, but it will be recorded. And so we should be able to post it someplace. So I think we'll stay on a minute so we get that recording taken care of. And just thank you again.
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you
Wonderful
all.
Thank you for
see you.
coming. Thank you so
all.
much.
Thank you.
There's some wonderful thank yous in the chat too. You may want to just take a peek at. They're really sweet.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Kathleen, thank you so much. What a good job you did.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, Just, you know, you just kept it flowing, you kept us going, and